This computer. Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast/journal channel. I'm here today with Jerry, and today we'll be talking about his paper, his interest in philosophy, and what sparked that interest, as well as some other things about Jerry. Yeah. And to begin, why don't you just introduce yourself, your name, school, what you're intending to study, and so forth.
Yeah, all right, amazing. First of all, it's an honor for me to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful that my writing was selected to be published at Dialexicon. So hey everyone. My name is Jerry. I'm a senior at Collingwood School in Vancouver, BC, one of the rainiest cities in the world. Besides philosophy, I love public speaking and debate, economics and programming. I think I'm going to work towards those areas in the future in university. And in my spare time, you can find me playing basketball with my friends or learning a new jazz lick on the saxophone.
That's awesome. Wow, what an intro. Those are actually a few of those things that you mentioned, econ, philosophy, and jazz are actually some of my favorites too. So that's great.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, some things to talk about. I guess my first question beyond that is, what first piqued your interest in philosophy? Is there like anything in particular, or did it kind of just creep up on you?
Yeah, I mean, originally, I think I took the philosophy 12 course at my school for the same reason as any other kid. It was an easy class. There was zero tests and exams, so I was very excited for the class. But then as I got into the class was like a lot of philosophical discussions. And as a debater, I love to have conversations and arguments, so I just naturally fit in with the class. And slowly, I really started to develop a passion and an interest in some of the philosophical debates that we had in class. Um, just to give an example, like one of my favorite topics from the class was the common trolley problem. A lot of people know about it, but basically, where as a bystander, you notice that a trolley is headed towards straight towards like five people, and they're about to kill the five people who are tied up to the tracks and who are unable to move. But you can pull the lever and have the trolley go on a sidetrack, which has one person tied up to the track. So it's an ethical dilemma between utilitarianism, which is like saving the most people, and doing something that is morally wrong by becoming like partially responsible for the death of a person. So I thought that that was super interesting. And I remember we spent the whole class just discussing this moral dilemma. And the best part of philosophy is that there is no right answer, right? Some people supported killing the five people, the others supported pulling the lever and then killing that one person. And again, there was no correct answer. So sort of this ambiguity and like sort of ubiquity of philosophy allows for like an amalgamation of diverse perspective, controversial opinions where everyone can contribute something to the discussion, regardless of their background.
Yeah, that's a great answer. The trolley problem actually, and this whole duel between utilitarianism and deontology was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because in your paper, you go with these two schools of thought to prove your argument about why vaccines should be mandatory.
Oh,
So that is something that we can discuss later on when we get to your paper, but that's great. Do you have a personal stance on the trolley problem? Like, are you more in favor of one side, or I guess
I I think this is illustrated in my paper as well. And again, we're already jumping ahead of ourselves, which is fantastic. But I think it's important to prioritize the common good and utilitarianism.
Mhm.
However, I think I also believe in psychological egoism. So basically, where humans prioritize their self-interest. And I think sometimes, even when the common good is better, I think most people will probably choose not to pull the lever in fear of being held responsible for the crime of murder. So again, to prioritize their self-interest. Again, that's just my opinion. There could be a bunch of different answers.
Gotcha. I can't help but just follow up on that. Could you explain a bit more this idea of psychological egotism? Like, could you explain maybe, in what circumstances is it just to prioritize your ego above, the interests of others, and to what extent that could be the case?
Um, hmm. I think okay, again, this is weird because I think I talk a little bit
Sorry,
about
I'm not trying to grill you. I'm just curious.
yeah, no. It's perfect. It's a great question. I think it depends on the costs involved.
Mm,
Uh, and for me, if the cost of saving another person, where you have to give up something, maybe give up your own life to help save a kid who's drowning in the lake, if that cost is perhaps higher than the cost of saving, so like the cost to yourself is higher than the cost of doing the action, then I think that at that point it's okay for psychological egoism to take in play again, right? So that's why I think in real life, in a lot of legal cases, people aren't held responsible as the bystander because of that logic. Because if they argue that there was some sort of cost that they had to give up, oftentimes we can prioritize the self-interest in those situations.
right. Okay. Thank you for that. That just a clarification for people who aren't familiar with the term. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess we can segue because you answered that question pretty well. I think we can segue to, the journal. How did you first stumble upon the journal, and then maybe talk about what your writing process was like in terms of, did you have to go through numerous drafts? Like, what are things to keep in mind for youth in general when they're editing philosophical type papers? And yeah, take it away from there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the philosophy class, my teacher,
Mhm.
shout out to Mr. Canarudi, who's my philosophy
Oh,
teacher.
awesome. Okay.
Yeah. He actually recommended on Google Classroom, he made this post and he was like, hey, look, there's this cool opportunity called Dialexicon, where basically you can write an article and get it published. And I read through some of the old journal and I was immediately interested, the first edition, some really good articles in there. And I recommend everyone go give it a read. And one thing that I also realized is that there's not a lot of resources for use philosophy philosophy out there. So I definitely think that Dialexicon is a great platform, especially for youth, to really publish their research. And I was really interested by this idea of putting out my idea out there because, firstly, I want my research to have an impact. That's why I chose the topic that I did, because I think there is some sort of valuable conclusion that we can reach from it and how philosophy can help in that process. The other thing is just that I want people to enjoy philosophy more. Hopefully, like read my article. I hope that you find it fun. I hope that it was a good, interesting read for you. If not, then I'm sorry.
I'm
But
sure.
yeah, but so in regards to the writing process, to practice debate, I don't know if you've done this, but I've often watched other people debate. I don't know, is that something common to do? I like to
Yeah,
go, yeah,
pretty
I like
common.
to go, yeah, I like to go through YouTube videos, look at some of the university debaters. They make some very good arguments. And one day I came across a video where the topic was something along the lines of this house believed that governments should make children's vaccinations obligatory, something like that. I can't quite remember which tournament it was, but there were some very interesting arguments made, and that really stuck with me. So when I saw the prompts on Dialexicon, the one with the mandated vaccine, like that one almost immediately just clicked with me. And I was like, oh, I'm going to write about this topic. And I thought it was a great topic to talk about right now, especially with COVID-19 going rampant and being unstoppable. Um, Especially when I think like Teresa Tam, so the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, like a few months back or something, she said something about how like almost everyone is guaranteed to get COVID or something like that.
Mm.
It's just that at one point, COVID is just not something that we could stop. And only now I don't even think we've fully stopped COVID. It's just become less severe because of vaccinations and things like that. Um, so challenges, right? Was that in?
Yeah. I mean, the natural segue you could talk about.
Yeah. So, I mean, one challenge was definitely trying to ensure that my paper sounded as academic as possible. Because my topic is pretty controversial, at least I think, in my opinion. And I do believe, I think everyone is entitled to their own opinions. Again, with philosophy, the beautiful thing is that there is no absolute truth. To ensure when I'm making arguments that I try to provide it with evidence, I try to provide it with logic in order to put out a solid argument there instead of just attacking like a concept without any like evidence or arguments or claims to back it up. So that was definitely a challenge. The biggest thing I think I learned from writing this paper is that so we always, before taking philosophy, me and my friends always had this joke about how philosophy is just the most useless major. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that anymore, because definitely one thing that I have definitely learned from writing this paper is that philosophy is inherently interdisciplinary. Oftentimes you synthesize concepts from law, mathematics, economics, politics, and all sorts of different areas of study. Furthermore, philosophy can be applied to our justice and political system and actually have a tangible impact, or at the very least help with like decision making. So for example, in my paper, through the lens of philosophy, I'm able to arrive at a conclusion from the ethical perspective if we should mandate a vaccine policy or not.
Yeah, that's great. So what I'm hearing is that, in the beginning you were drawn to this topic of mandatory vaccines for a few reasons, but one of which being it was a very pressing topic, and it is controversial, which is quite unfortunate actually, but that's a reality. And then also you talk about your debate background and kind of watching people talk about these motions. And I guess on that idea of debate, are there any notable differences you found in preparing for, let's say, an impromptu motion in a debate round versus writing out a paper on pretty much the exact same topic word for word? I'm just curious to see if there's any differences. Obviously, there's a lot of similarities. Kind of your comments on the distinction between the two.
I mean, one big difference is obviously the research that you can do behind it, right? Impromptu debates are very off the top of the head, and that's why a lot of times statistics or facts or opinions aren't really used or quoted. You have to memorize them in order to be able to use them. So with my paper, I think it's a little bit more, it's giving off more of a stronger and more clear, concise argument than perhaps a impromptu debate, because I am able to find evidence for the things that I am saying, use statistics to back up my arguments, but also quote some of the famous people like John Stuart Mill or John Locke, or Aristotle.
Right.
So yeah, that's definitely a big difference there.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe, yeah, on the flip side, is there anything in particular about, I mean, I would assume that like through practicing generating arguments over and over again, you're probably familiar with the process of writing an argument like this. Would you have any advice for like common pitfalls that one would fall into writing a kind of philosophical paper for Dialexicon or any other journal? And maybe, some warnings about like what you can do better to overcome those pitfalls.
Oh, definitely. Actually, one other difference, right, on the topic of this, is actually terminology. I think sometimes in debate, I just throw out terminology that sound very, very good, and sound very stylish, but actually don't really mean the thing that I thought it meant. And being able to write a philosophical paper really made sure that all my arguments were clear and concise and logical in order, and also that the terminologies that I use actually meant what it meant and that it flowed properly. So one advice I would give for other people, it's definitely that to make sure that the terminology that you use for everything is correct, that you make sure that you do a double check research to make sure that what you're saying is actually what you're trying to say is actually being conveyed, and what you're trying to say actually means what it is supposed to mean. Definitely also watch out for logical pitfalls, logical fallacies. Those are definitely common. One advice would definitely just to be able to like I really like creating like some sort of outline for a paper before I write it. So outlining what your argument is, what your example is, what your analysis, very standard high school stuff, before making the argument. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all great. That's the thing you pointed out about the style is something I've definitely observed, not just in debating, but also in whenever people are writing articles in general. There have been some articles where that I've read that have just been, extremely fluffy, and you use this like fancy big terminology, but in reality, it's just kind of all hiding what the actual argument is, and the actual argument itself is like frail. So
I actually
definitely
think
something to.
I actually think I'm guilty of that because the first version of the article that I wrote like was pretty fluffy, pretty long. Definitely exceeded the word limit. So yeah, it really yeah. So one thing I learned was that you got to be clear and concise, cut down on some of the fluff, get to the argument, and yeah, have a
Yeah,
paper.
that I mean that's a natural kind of, that's the reason why we draft in the first place, is to have that crappy version, and then afterwards you kind of get rid of the fluff. But
Yeah.
ultimately I thought, I mean, one of the reasons why I really liked your paper was that it read across very well. Like, it was easy to follow, it was clear, and there wasn't that much fluff involved, but you still had a very strong argument where you brought in a bunch of different philosophers and ideas from, contractualism to you mentioned John Locke as well in this, the social contract, and you also mentioned um so the duty to rescue with the singer and the drowning child in the pond.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of different schools of thought coming in,
Yeah,
and a lot of
hopefully,
times.
hopefully it didn't get too jumbled up. It was clear. I was
No,
trying to
no, not
put
at
in
all.
as much things as possible. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. I suppose we can. I mean, one other question I wanted to ask you about the general stuff is
Hmm.
do you have any philosophy resources that you'd recommend in terms of books, YouTube channels, podcasts, or anything really that you found helpful?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is like the Bible to my religion. It is everything that I use. It is what I use for class. It is what I use for this paper. It's a very helpful resource that I definitely recommend people check out. And I know that I think you're a Stanford student as well, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, amazing resource. Definitely something that you should use. In terms of books, I really like my favorite book is Justice by Michael Sandel. And yeah, so I one of my favorite units that I studied in philosophy is ethics. And I think Michael Sandel argues a little bit about how we should make our ethical decision and what his ethical approach is by maximizing three different things. I think it was virtue, utility, and consent. So maximizing those three things in order to make a logical decision.
Mhm.
In terms of YouTube channels, I don't know, Crash Course is pretty good. I remember
Yeah, they're fun.
those are good videos. Um, yeah, yeah. Oh, The Matrix, perfect. Really good
Oh
reason
wow,
to study
okay.
philosophy. Yeah, trust me. Yeah,
The
definitely.
the Matrix, like the trilogy series, the movie series.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. Definitely
I'm a
some good.
big fan. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely some good philosophical dilemmas.
Red pill or blue pill?
Yeah, red pill or blue pill.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you're watching this, check out all the resources Jerry mentioned. I personally can attest to almost all of those resources being pretty much, yeah, all of those resources being helpful.
Mhm.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is definitely a good one if you're looking for in-depth articles about different schools of thought. Like, you don't know what pragmatism is, just search it up and then find the link for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and bam, you're all set. And Microsoft.
Just out of curiosity, what would you pick, the red or blue pill?
Uh, it's hard. I mean, I in theory, I think picking the red pill would be the noble thing to do.
Yeah.
But in reality, when it comes down to the wire, you really
Yeah.
don't know. Your instincts kind of tell you one thing, and your morality can tell you another. But I would say red pill. I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah. Who
What
knows?
about you?
I definitely agree with you. It just feels like red pill is like the hero one, like where you're becoming a hero, rescuing humans, and it's like the moral thing to do, but almost from a practical perspective, taking the blue pill and just living a normal life where ignorance is bliss is almost like a better option. So I don't know. I'm actually not too sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard choice, and I,
Yeah.
I mean, I admire Neo. So
Probably depends on the mood. If I'm feeling a little bit adventurous, I'll pick the red pill.
yeah, exactly. Um,
Definitely.
mood That's an interesting title, like mood swings affecting
Uh,
philosophical decisions. Yeah, I mean, I guess we can jump into the paper specific questions because we've already passed like to the 20-minute mark. So was there anything in general that you wanted to comment on your paper? Because I'm happy to go down whatever rabbit hole you want to.
hmm. Comments. Let's see. Yeah, again, I would just remember, I would just add as a preface to my article that, yeah, again, it's pretty controversial. And as someone who has my own background and identity, I obviously have my own very unique thoughts. For example,
Mhm.
uh, I'm more agnostic, so religion to
Mhm.
me is not that important compared to a lot of other people. So I would definitely say as a preface for my article that everything is my own opinion, and it's okay that if you agree with it or if you don't agree with it, either is fine. Because again, the beauty of philosophy is that everyone can have their own opinions. There is no right answer, and there, in my opinion, at the very least, there is no absolute truth. So yeah,
Hmm.
that's the only comment I would probably give.
That I mean that I could ask you a lot about that for like the
Yeah.
next 30 minutes, but
Yeah,
we won't.
definitely. That is in of itself a whole discussion we can have
Okay.
about truth and things like that. Yeah.
Wow. And that is actually a good launching off point for your argument and the topic, because what you said just there was just kind of there isn't this absolute truth that people can have different opinions about things. Um, but in your paper, what you're kind of arguing is that, you know, vaccines should be mandatory for all, regardless of kind of what your beliefs are on it in terms of anything varying from like the maybe the skepticism that it works, maybe the emotional discomfort of taking a vaccine or whatnot, whatever reasons people have for not taking it. So I guess the question is how do we kind of reconcile those two views? Like, is to what extent is it okay for somebody to have a different belief, and to what extent is it within the government's right, if not responsibility, to regulate? And I know you answer this, but maybe just another
Yeah.
time.
Uh, I think, in my opinion, I love discourse. Again, as a debater, I think discourse is what drives our world, and I think having different opinions and opposing opinions are perfectly good. And that is what actually where if we play devil's advocate, that is where we're able to come up with the best solutions. And again, in debate, you got to consider both sides, and if you see the perspective from both sides, that's when you're able to make the best arguments and conclusions.
Mhm.
I think the limit is where speech becomes hateful towards others. So especially in the case of hate speech, I think when it has a harm to a group of people, to the common good, to others, I think that is when speech has to be limited. I feel like this is slightly off tangent. It's getting into an argument about free speech,
Yeah.
but I would definitely say I think the government's responsibility is not to prioritize its own self-interest, but to do whatever is better for the common good, to really take things into account from a utilitarian perspective. But again, that is one of the responsibilities of the government, to really try I mean, the role of the government is to help the citizens. The citizens, well, at the very least in a democratic process, elect the governments to represent them. So thus, the government has an obligation to represent the citizens and follow the will of the citizens to promote the good of the citizens. But I can definitely see other people making arguments about how the government should prioritize individual liberty as well and like help individual people. I can definitely see that being raised as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So, yeah, the question, it was my bad. The question was more intended towards, if people's beliefs, like for example, the belief that vaccines aren't important or that they're dangerous, lead potentially to harmful actions. Something in a similar vein, except not the free speech version.
Yeah.
But you answered it. You answered it well.
Yeah.
That
I mean,
you
I
know.
definitely think it's okay for people to believe that vaccines aren't effective, but again, I'm more of a scientific person, so
Mhm.
I definitely just look at scientific evidence, and from a scientific perspective, vaccines are demonstrated to be effective.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so I guess another question I have about the paper is you mentioned duty of easy rescue,
Mhm.
and sort of this. I mean, do you want to briefly explain maybe to our viewers what that is and under what circumstances that would apply?
Sure. So, at least this is from my understanding. A duty of easy rescue means that if an action is inexpensive, and the benefit of that action to the third party outweighs the cost, then everyone is obligated to undertake that action.
Mhm.
So in my case, I gave the example of, let's say if a kid is drowning in a lake, and the only cost of you saving that kid is that you have to dirty your shoes or get your pants wet. I think then at that point, people have a duty of easy rescue because the cost, which is getting your pants wet, making your shoes dirty, is no greater than the cost of the life of the children. And if we wrap it back to the beginning of the interview where we had the discussion about when it is okay to not rescue that kid, when it is okay for you to have ego and things like that. I think that's when, like, for example, if you get into that water and you might risk your life because the river is like, it's like rapid and it might kill you if you can't rescue that kid. I think at that point, then there might not be a duty of easy rescue because again, the cost might be your life, which can be argued that is not greater than saving the life of the children. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that the Singer argument is super fascinating because I don't know if you've had a chance to read his book Famine, Affluence, and Morality, but he kind of just
Oh yeah, that's definitely a good read. I haven't gotten the chance to read it yet, but I've definitely heard about it. It's a very good book.
yeah, I think you'll enjoy it a lot, and
Yeah.
practical ethics as well. Although Singer has been recently controversial, so it's
Yeah.
not everyone's cup of tea. I don't know if it's 100% mine. But but he talks about, like, the drowning child analogy is sort of a reason as to why everyone ought to give close to, almost as much of their income as possible, beyond a certain, like, unreasonable level
Yeah.
to charities and the poor. And clearly this is not what's happening in the status quo, because people, are greedy. People aren't 100% altruistic in the way that Singer expects. So I guess this raises the question of, in some cases where all you're mandated to give, like, let's say, is like a very small percentage of your money, most people would say, yes, I'd be willing to give that. But to what extent do you think duty of rescue no longer counts as easy? Like, is there a certain point at which we can clearly define this line, or is there just this massive gray area that depends from person to person?
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing question. Definitely. I think there's no black and white, and to put a specific threshold, I don't think it's possible. And it's just like it's again, if we go back to the money thing, okay, like you can give $1, you can give $2. Let's say you can give 1% of your income, 2% of your income. Okay, 3% of your income, like 4% of your income, like where's the exact threshold? And to me, I don't think there is an exact threshold. And I think maybe because arguments can be made for wherever the threshold is. So we can't really have a threshold. So thus we just have to, and that's what's so tricky about ethics. And that's why there is no correct answer, in my opinion. It's because everything exists on a gray scale and there's a bunch of different arguments that you can make for where the threshold can be. So yeah, that's definitely my opinion.
Right. So there is a gray area. But yeah, it seems like with the whole vaccines, and that was kind of just to, like, try to pick at you, but this seems like with the whole vaccines debate, that's it's much clearer. There's a very clear benefit and there's minimal cost, and so it's the question is kind of who are the groups of individuals who, like, still refuse, and to what extent are those reasons valid? Because I guess with religious reasons, you would treat them differently than
Yeah. So for me, I think I don't know if I addressed this in my article or not, but I mean, one of the things that I would say is definitely we wouldn't force vaccines onto people who can't take vaccines, right? Like if they die
Sounds
from
right.
vaccine, allergic to vaccines, then obviously at that point, then that's probably a threshold. But yeah, even from my articles, it's sort of just a generalization of certain groups, like some of the major groups that I identified, who are opposed to vaccines. So the people who are religious, the people who argue that there's like freedom of choice, the people who perhaps who don't believe in the vaccine's effectiveness. Those are like the few groups that I identified. But definitely, that's just a vague generalization of the population who believes that vaccines aren't like they don't want to get vaccines, right? And I think when it comes down to philosophy, we oftentimes have to make those generalizations, otherwise we can't come to an exact conclusion, right? Because there's so many different groups of people that we just have to sort of generalize and then create a threshold, and that's it, right? So that's definitely a limitation for my article, maybe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I do think that's true. There are instances where you can't, have a different theory for every single person that exists on Earth, but at the same time, you also have to be wary of making these overbearing generalizations because they could be harmful as well. But I think in your article you're pretty clear on, this is there are like certain exceptions to this rule. Like there are people who are fervently religious who obviously can't take the vaccine, as you
Yeah,
mentioned.
definitely.
So you
Uh-huh.
do like kind of navigate your way um, around that issue.
Mhm.
Um, Something else I wanted to talk about on this, and the way this is all kind of like flowing into each other is great. But you mentioned the generalizability principle, which is kind of like you say that there's this action. If it's wrong under the circumstances where, if everyone were to do that action, it would result in catastrophe, then,
Mhm.
you would have a
Yeah.
responsibility as an individual to not do it. And so when I read it, I was struck by how like this also applies to a lot of other current events, right? Like if you think of climate change, if
Mhm.
one person litters, it's not a big deal. Still bad, but not a big deal. If everyone litters, it's catastrophic. Politics, like with voter turnout, and taxation, you mentioned yourself. I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, does this principle have its limits? Like, do you think it's always a legitimate reason to dictate someone's choice or to restrict someone's choice? And are there situations where it might be flawed potentially? Yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Whoa, I've never thought about it that way before, because it's a pretty sound argument that we're making here, right? And again, the generalization principle is the argument that a lot of people use for littering, right?
Yeah.
Many people like again, even in my article, it was like an even if argument, right? So a lot of people would say that, hey, the action that I do doesn't have a big impact. Oh, if I throw a piece of can on the ground, that's okay because I'm not hurting the environment that much, right? It's the effects are so marginal, right? But
Hmm.
the generalization principle basically says that even if the ends are unjustified, even if the ends are justified or like the impact is marginal, we still shouldn't do that action because the action itself is just morally incorrect. Like imagine a world where everybody littered, then the generalization principle applies, where we realize that the action of littering is wrong. But in terms of flaws, Hmm.
I I personally didn't have like one in mind when I wrote it. I was just wondering if
I'm curious now as well. Let me think a little bit.
right, yeah.
Perhaps, actually, I'm not too sure. I can't think of an example in which
No worries.
yeah,
It could
I
just
can't
be like
really think
a
of a
good
flaw.
principle.
No, I definitely do think there are counter arguments, but I would need some more time to think a little bit about that. Yeah, do a
Gotcha.
little bit more research, get some evidence to back up my arguments before I make it. Because
Yeah,
I want to just say things out of thin air. Yeah,
true,
definitely.
true.
Mhm.
Very valid. Sorry for putting you through that. I didn't mean to put
Oh, no, no, no worries, no worries. That's definitely a good question. It's something I'll probably think about after the interviews. I'll lay on my bed in the night and I'll think about that.
you. Exactly, the spirit of philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, it struck me too that the generalizability principles is pretty similar to like Kant's categorical imperative, where it,
Mm,
he said like if you were to do something, an action, and you were to apply it universally as a rule, would that action still be valid? Like, would you enjoy that rule's presence, or this is
yeah.
a bad way
Well,
of
that's cool. I haven't actually drawn the relationship between that and Immanuel Kant's approach to ethic, which is categorical imperative. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a cool connection. Yeah.
Yeah. But that could maybe we could look into, critiques against Kant's philosophy also as a way to
Mm.
find flaws in this. But
Mhm,
Seems
potentially.
pretty sound to me though overall. But let me know if you think of anything that's a counter argument.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, another thing you mentioned is contractualism and the social contract tradition, which obviously dates back to Locke and John Stuart Mill. Um, do you think that do you like maybe talk me through like why you chose to include that in the essay and what like what reason like where amongst your arguments do you think that lies in terms of like how compelling it is, or just maybe like walk me through your reasoning as to like why you chose to include Locke, because I know that Locke is like pretty common in many political philosophy arguments, but this is just like an open-ended question. Maybe just elaborate on that choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I wanted to, because in debate we often consider things from two perspectives, right? The principle and the practical. I think you've heard that quite a bit. And
Yeah.
oftentimes we use the word, actually one terminology that we use incorrectly a lot of times is principle, right? A lot of people use principle incorrectly in debate. Sorry, but anyway, but basically what I was thinking is, again, this was an even if argument. So even if people say that perhaps that there is no practical benefit, so even if we assume that, oh, most of the community is already vaccinated, that we've already achieved herd immunity, and perhaps there's like 5 people who refuse to get vaccines because of religious beliefs or doubts in its effectiveness, that perhaps vaccines can give autism. And basically my argument was that there is this principal responsibility, that basically when we're born into a society, that obviously what John Locke says about contractualism is basically that if we exist within this sort of this government or the society, that there exists this invisible social contract towards the government and towards each other. So I definitely really resonate with Locke on that, and a lot of his arguments could have been I applied a lot of his arguments into my paper, because he talks a lot about contractualism. One of his quotes was that, like, John Locke said that we as humans are obligated under the law of nature to respect each other's rights to life, liberty, and property. And I think that quote was really effective in sort of illustrating this idea that, like, you know, even if we try to prioritize people's right to choice, sort of we have to disregard that right to choice at the point where we recognize that by not getting vaccinated, you're harming others people's right to life, right? And that social contract sort of illustrates why that is morally impermissible to do.
Right. Yeah. I guess, and a common critique of the social contract tradition is that obviously, like when you're signing into a contract, both parties need to opt
Yeah.
into the contract somehow, and to consent. And there's many people,
Mhm.
countless scholars that argue that there is no social contract. Nobody ever really signed, engraved this in a rock or something, and because of that,
Yeah.
specifically under this heading of like vaccine refusal, there are people who would never want to opt into that contract in the first place. So what would your response be to sort of silence those critics?
Um, I mean, I think the social contract, again, you are correct. It is an invisible social contract. It's not outlined on a rock. It's not
Right.
written anywhere else. Basically, I would say I think it's yeah, I think it's an option of opt-in. Okay. I think that, so oftentimes people make the argument that when you're born, you never really chose to be a part of the society, you never chose to be a part of civilization. However, I think at one point where we decide to use things from the government. So, for example, we use the government's benefit system, we use the healthcare systems, we set up society where we have jobs and things like that, and division of labor. I think at that point, there is then a reciprocate that we automatically opt into society at the point where we enjoy society's benefits. So the fact that we have a government to protect us and for us to be safe and civilized, that there's no violence or assault, I think that means we are already just unconsciously opting in to be okay with the social contract. At the point where we're using up some of the resources of the governments and the benefits of the governments. Thus, we have a reciprocate responsibility in order to oblige to the social contract.
Got it. Yeah, that's solid. That's solid. Um, Yeah, I mean, those were all the questions I had pretty much prepared. It was mainly like just trying to like being curious about some of the more specific schools of thought that you used, but
Mhm.
obviously the big two were utilitarianism and deontology. Um, that that pretty much wraps up my end. Do you have anything else that you would want, viewers or readers of your paper to know about almost anything, like the writing process, the topic itself, anything that I missed, basically?
Um, I mean, no, I think you did a very comprehensive job going over some of the key concepts that I basically used in my paper. And I do definitely like, and again, I do definitely think that my paper is not flawless. There's a lot of things that you address and how you try to push me further to try to answer some of the more complex questions in regarding some of the theories. And that's why there has been so much critiques of this and that in history, right? It's basically having this discussion. So yeah, it was a very comprehensive interview. Thank you very much.
No problem. And again, definitely not meant as a critique because the paper itself was really good and we published it for a reason. And thank you again for writing a great paper that it was a pleasure to read and the judges probably thought so as well. Um, and yeah, thanks for having this interview with me, Jerry.
All right, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.